Good evening, everyone. My name is Corky. I'm with Yolo Basin Foundation, and we are here for Flyway Nights. I'm going to bring up my screen here so that I can introduce to you what we're doing this evening. So this evening, we're going to be learning about restoration work. In particular, restoration work taking place in the Delta. And we have 3 speakers this evening to share with us, which is pretty exciting. We have Stephanie Freed from Ecosystem Investment Partners, Patricia Valcarcel. Oh, you just told me how to say that. Valcarcel. No, there's no L. Say it for me, Patricia.
Valcarcel.
So, sorry.
You had it.
Patricia from WRA Environmental Consultants, and John Pritchard of Environmental Science Associates. So 3 of our consulting agencies are going to be presenting this evening. I also want to make sure that everybody is aware of what we're doing next month. So we're doing some more habitat restoration next month in April. And notice it's not the first Thursday, it's the second Thursday. That's going to be with Heather Nichols of the Resource Conservation District, and the work that they've been doing in the Yolo Bypass wildlife area, forming habitat corridors. Also upcoming, got to mention Duck Days now. We just got our new graphic, so I wanted to share that with you. And some of you, if you're volunteers with us, may have noticed that we're also just started to post the positions. So if you're interested in helping us out, getting ready for Duck Days, take a look on Better Impact and get ourselves all going for that too. So bringing you back to me, I'm going to be passing over to Stephanie Freed. Stephanie's going to be our first speaker tonight. So here you go, Stephanie.
Thank you. Great. Should be sharing my screen. Give me a thumbs up if you, oh, great. You can see it. Okay. So tonight we are going to be talking about and this is a mouthful, Lookout Slough Tidal Habitat Restoration and Flood Improvement Project, which from this point forward, we will just refer to as the Lookout Slough Project. Just to save all those words, it is a multi-benefit project. I am the Assistant Director of Operations at Ecosystem Investment Partners, and the project manager, John and Patricia. I think you guys can introduce yourselves once we get to your part of the presentation, and I'll just jump right in. And then I think we're going to reserve any questions until the end of the presentation, just because we're going to be building off of each other. And I'm going to start off a little bit more brief, and then I think John and Patricia are going to get into a lot more detail. So here's an overview of what we'll be walking through tonight. I'm going to start with going over the project purpose and background and focus on why we cited the project where we did, what the project goals are, and the pre-project conditions for the property, and then what the design entails at a high level. And then I will hand it over to John to discuss the hydrology and hydraulics and the design considerations that went into that. And then Patricia is going to walk us through wildlife ecology and how that has played into design considerations. And then we'll go over some takeaways before we get into a Q&A. So I wanted to start with introducing who Ecosystem Investment Partners is, because a lot of folks don't know or aren't familiar with us. So we are a private equity firm that invests private capital in environmental restoration across the US. We are the largest private investment manager that's focused 100% on ecological restoration in the entire country. And we specialize in large-scale environmental restoration. So to date, we have completed over 40,000 acres of wetland restoration and have close to 1 million linear feet of streams that we've restored across the country since 2007. So we do wetland restoration, stream restoration, restore habitat for specific species or to improve water quality. But wherever we work with experts, local experts for the various technical fields that kind of inform the design of the restoration. So for the Lookout Slough project in California, we have formed a public-private partnership with the Department of Water Resources. And under this partnership, EIP is contracted to design, entitle, and to construct the project. So we got under contract with DWR in October of 2018, and we started construction this past May, so less than 4 years after getting under contract with them. And this project is expected to be fully constructed in late 2024. So this is a multi-benefit project that has 2 funding sources with DWR. The first is to satisfy DWR's obligations to restore delta smelt habitat, to satisfy their biological opinion obligations for the State Water Project. So for those who are not familiar with what is a biological opinion, these are the permits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service that were required for the State Water Project, so for diverting water down to Southern California. And these mandate 8,000 acres of habitat for delta smelt and some other protected fishes that are being impacted from the State Water Project. And then the second funding source and main project benefit is to widen a portion of the Yolo Bypass to increase flood storage and conveyance. On the right of the screen in that table are the project goals. So these project goals actually have a lot of objectives kind of buried under them, but just thought I'd start high level. So the project will create freshwater tidal habitat to support native fish species and improve food web productivity for native fishes. It will also support viable populations of the other special status aquatic and terrestrial species known to occur in this area of the Delta. And then the flood benefits that I just mentioned, it will provide flood storage and conveyance within the Yolo Bypass to reduce the chance of catastrophic flooding. So here is the project delivery team for the project, where EIP is the project developer who's under contract with DWR. Just wanted to highlight the expertise that we really brought into informing the design and permitting of the project. ESA and WRA are here in the room today, and we also have relied on geotechnical engineering, civil engineering, legal counsel from Blackburn, Wood Rogers, and Mitchell Chadwick. And our construction team, including Hanford ARC, who is a restoration contractor, have actually been in the room with us from the concept level of design for this project and really helped inform the design and permitting for the project, even though they're in the construction team bin. So that's been really helpful for us. So citing the project was really an important step, making sure that we're ensuring where we wanted to create this tidal marsh habitat for delta smelt is being completed in an area that makes sense to restore to tidal habitat, and that it will directly benefit the target fish species. So EIP responded to a DWR request for proposal for their delta smelt habitat, and these are the kinds of things we were looking for. The project location on the left of the screen is marked in a yellow outline, and it is due east of Vacaville, about 40 minutes south of Davis and located within the Cache Slough Complex region of the Delta in the southern extent of the Yolo Bypass. And I know John and Patricia have some maps that show this. So it occurs in an area known as the North Delta Arc of native fishes, which is that green band. And that is an area that UC Davis Center for Watershed Science fisheries experts identified as the zone that should be targeted for doing tidal restoration to benefit native fish recovery. So this is in that zone. It also, looking at the right map, it's in an area that in the early 1900s was historically tidal marsh habitat, which is exactly an ideal spot to do tidal restoration because the elevations on the site were historically tidal marsh habitat, so they're suitable and kind of target for doing restoration. And I know John is going to talk about that a little more. There's a bunch of regional plans that have identified this area as being a good spot to do what we're doing. So just wanted to highlight a couple examples. On the left is a Delta Stewardship Council map from the Delta Plan that identifies this area as priority habitat restoration area in the Cache Slough Complex area. And this is based on some of the things that I already said, why it makes sense to target this area. It's also identified in the 2016 Sacramento Basin-wide feasibility study as an area to do a setback levy for benefiting, reducing flood risk in the region. So it was an area that was actually considered for a setback levy. So we wanted to convey scale, which is just always so hard to do in these figures. The property, the Lookout Slough property is 3,400 acres. So we wanted to just put it over the city of Davis to give people who are familiar with Davis a sense of how large the site is. It's about 3.5 miles from north to south and 2 miles east to west, and it does cover a good portion of Davis if it was overlaid over top of it. It is the largest tidal habitat restoration project in California history. So it is quite significant and just always hard to keep this in mind when we're looking at these tiny little figures. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide going through what were the pre-project conditions when EIP purchased the land back in 2017. And I'll focus on what is meaningful and high level details, and then I'll go over and I'll talk about the project design. So yeah, as I mentioned, the property is 3,400 acres. I'm going to highlight areas with my cursor as I talk through this. It included mixed uses. So it had irrigated pasture that was about half of the property. And this was associated with what we call the Bullsby Ranch side. And then it also had a private duck club associated with the Liberty Farms duck club. So that was over here on this side. And then there's a smaller property that we refer to as Vogel that was essentially fallow. And that's about 60 acres. And so the majority of the property, with the exception of Vogel, is protected currently from bypass flooding through the protection of an Army Corps flood control levee. And this levee surrounds the perimeter of the property and essentially follows where the freshwater tidal sloughs are. So the levee goes along Shag Slough, which is a freshwater tidal slough, and then it wraps around the southern end here and continues up Cache Slough above Vogel, and then it continues up Haas Slough and ties in over here. So anything within the levee system, the existing levee system in here, Duck Slough, Sycamore Slough, and Lookout Slough are all non-tidal, and they have completely managed hydrology. So they're connected via screw gates to the tidal sloughs. There's a series of pumps and ditches that pump water out of those and convey water across the site via gravity. So anything within the interior of the property is not tidally influenced currently. And just for a sense of where we're at, the Yolo Bypass, it comes down along the Cache Slough side over here. And then some other things worth mentioning. It's hard to see on the aerial, but there are a series of PG&E high voltage transmission towers. There's 13 of them that span across the property. They kind of parallel Duck Slough here. So they span, I'll just kind of outline where they are with my cursor. And then they come down. There's one on Vogel. So these were also something that we had to consider working around. And kind of last bit of information. So Duck Slough, this non-tidal slough at the perimeter continues up north here. There is an existing county road called Liberty Island Road. It's like somewhat paved. It's not in the best shape. It parallels the northern perimeter of the property, and then it actually goes on top of the Cache Slough levee and turns into gravel for a portion of the levee for it to about here. So that's kind of orienting us to the existing conditions, or the pre-project conditions rather. It's an active construction site now, so it's not exactly like this now. So kind of turning over on the right to focus on the design. So this is the 100% design depicted here. And I'll start off with just saying everything that's shown in green here will ultimately be freshwater intertidal habitat. And anything that's shown in blue will be subtidal open waters. Even at low tides, it will be covered in at least a couple feet of water. And it was not a simple process to get to this design. We have modified the project design over 20 times through collecting and responding to input that we've received. We've had over 350 meetings, and that's not an exaggeration. We've actually been counting them with various partners, not limited to organizations, interested parties, public partners, experts, and agencies. And so it's been quite the journey to get to this 100% design that we've been under construction trying to build over the last year. So I'm going to describe the design in the order that it's being constructed generally. So the first thing that we're doing is building this new Army Corps flood control levee that will act as the setback levee. And this will be the future west levee of the Yolo Bypass. So it's going to be replacing Cache Slough levee. It goes here along Liberty Island Road and then turns south and follows Duck Slough. So we refer to this as the Duck Slough setback levee. And then post-project, everything that is intertidal habitat or tidal habitat will be part of the Yolo Bypass. So we also are building access roads out to these PG&E towers. So those are shown here with these little fingers that are like orange color. And these will be, when the bypass is an active upland habitat, and Patricia is going to talk about those more, but they will also serve species benefits. And then we'll also be improving the Cache Slough levees. So following my cursor, we're going to be improving all of this down here and improving the current project side slope to make it more stable. And the Cache Slough levee, which I know John is going to talk about more, it won't actually function as a flood control levee post-project because it will have, when the bypass is activated, floodwaters on both sides. So its function is going to change to a training levee. but it will be maintained as such, and it will essentially be maintaining water levels in Cache and Haas sloughs during bypass flood events. So the next thing we're doing is we are constructing over 20 miles of new tidal channels, which are represented here in blue, and these are quite significant in size. Some of them are ranging up to 600 feet wide, and they will convey tidal flows across the property about 2 miles across. And in the back end, they're connected to some ponds, which are also another species feature that Patricia will talk about. So another thing worth pointing out is the purple along the Shag Slough levee, and that there's 1,500 feet in the north end of the Shag Slough levee and 1,500 feet on the south end of the Shag Slough levee that are marked here in purple. Those areas will be degraded and armored, and those will serve as an inlet on the north and an outlet on the south for receiving bypass flooding when the bypass is active, to hold that flood storage within the project area. And then we also will be breaching the Shag Slough levee in 9 locations. Those are marked here with these blue dots. And don't want to forget about Vogel. Vogel also has 2 breaches, except those are 2 agricultural berms because this is not surrounded by an Army Corps flood control levee. And there is some tidal habitat being restored in here with tidal channels constructed. And then we are planting about 38 acres of riparian habitat that will be planted along portions of the PG&E access roads. That this is not depicted here, so I'll just describe it. But it will be planted along the PG&E roads, the remnant Shag Slough levee islands around the perimeter, and along the northern slope of the Cache Haas Slough training levee, and then along portions of the Vogel agricultural berm where riparian doesn't currently exist. And last but not least, there is a star here for the location of a new boat ramp. So the northernmost breach is going to have a boat ramp constructed at the northern end of it. And this will be a waterway access point for the public to hand launch small watercraft and access the over 20 miles of new tidal channels that are being created in the project area. So this land was previously private, but it will be open to the public through these new navigable waterways. And then it will also be a launch point for people to access the greater adjacent areas. So with that, I did just want to point out a fun little spoiler. So we actually completed construction of Vogel this year, and just had some photos to share. So Vogel, this is about 60 acres, and we took this photo right after we opened up the first breach. So we had constructed the tidal channels in here, made sure all the elevations were below what they needed to be intertidal habitat, and then we breached the agricultural berm, and here Vogel is filling up for the first time. And then we got some photos from the levee, kind of from here looking this way, of Vogel being inundated at mean low or low water, so daily low tide and daily high tide. So I think I will turn it over to John, and he's going to go through hydrology and hydraulics and the design considerations that he informed for the project.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephanie. Appreciate it. My name is John Pritchard. I am a civil engineer with ESA, Environmental Science Associates. I've been practicing in the Sacramento region for, I'll just say more than 20 years, but less than 25. I've worked everywhere along the Sacramento Valley between Keswick and Collinsville. Spent quite a bit of time working on projects in Yolo and Solano County over the years, and I really love working in this part of the world. And working on a project like this is definitely one of the highlights of my career. So Stephanie, why don't we just go ahead and move to the next slide, and we'll kind of get into the details. I'm going to repeat some of the things that Stephanie said and get into a little bit more detail. I know someone asked in the chat what a training levy is. I'll talk about that here in a moment. But I'm just going to kind of step through each of the elements that we focused on from a design perspective, starting with the flood control elements. So really focusing on the public safety and making sure that the level of flood protection remains in place for the areas that need to be kept dry by the state federal project. So as Stephanie mentioned, the first piece of infrastructure that goes into this project is building a new setback levee that's going to replace the flood protection that's currently offered by the west levee of the Yolo Bypass along Cache Slough, and then also where the current Cache Slough training levee keeps this area dry, so that we can restore connectivity between Cache Slough and the Yolo Bypass to the property. And so this new levee that EIP has been working with Hanford to construct this past year, it's around 3 miles long. It, like all of the levees on the Yolo Bypass, needs to provide a minimum of 6 feet of freeboard, which is essentially 6 feet of, it's got to be built 6 feet taller than the design water surface elevation. In this case, we're designing for the 100-year flood. And so basically you've got an elevation generally of 19 to 20 feet. Add 6 feet to that, you get to a top elevation that's 26, plus we add another foot for sea level rise and climate resiliency. This levee relative to the toe on the on the ground at the inside edge of the project here, it's over 22 feet tall. And Stephanie built a really good physical model of what that looks like when we had the groundbreaking ceremony. But this is really quite a large piece of infrastructure that EIP is building. It includes a 25-foot deep bentonite slurry cutoff wall to prevent under seepage under the levee. And at its base, Stephanie, can you remind me how wide the footprint of this levee is?
200 feet.
200 feet. So we all know what a football field looks like. You know, think about this as about 2/3 of that. So let's go to the next slide. So the next piece I'm going to focus on is what's now the west levee of the Yolo Bypass. This is a section of the project that will largely remain in place with a few significant modifications. The levee is going to be breached in 9 locations to provide connectivity between the tidal channel network and Cache Slough. So you're going to have these large, wide openings where in the levee where it sits today. And then on the northern and southern ends of the alignment, a portion of the levee will be degraded, basically cut down to create an overflow and outflow weir on either side, so that more water can be pulled into the site during larger flood events. So the idea here is to improve the efficiency when you get into flood events that are around a 6-year return frequency or higher. So Stephanie, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So when Stephanie talked about the training levee that's going to remain in place, the intent of this feature is essentially water levels in the Yolo Bypass north of this alignment are slightly higher than the water levels in the Cache Slough and Haas Slough reaches. And if this feature were to go away, water from the Yolo Bypass would flow across it and raise water levels in those reaches. And the levees along those reaches are already suffering from a lot of deferred maintenance. There's been subsidence. They are fragile, and increasing the loading on them is definitely a concern of this project. So the idea is to leave this embankment in place and have it act as a hydraulic barrier between the Yolo Bypass and Cache Slough and Haas Slough. In addition to providing a break between the static water levels, It will also act as a wind wave buffer and a wave break, because one of the things that we see when it gets very windy out here is you have these very large fetch lengths across the Yolo Bypass, and you can get waves that are up to 4 feet high. And so the idea is to use this as a break so that we don't worsen conditions again on the neighboring levee system. A couple of the things that are being done that are pretty unique with respect to how the training levee is being treated, because of the foundation conditions at the site. Blackburn, who's the geotechnical engineer that we've been working with on this project, determined that adding additional material and weight to the levee and trying to raise it was not an option, because the levee would essentially just sink onto the material that's below this is all historic Tule marsh and peaty type soils that will consolidate and compress when that additional loading is placed on it. So the approach was to basically take the existing levee prism and do some lowering the height in some locations and flattening the slopes on the land side to improve stability. This particular levee has had a lot of stability issues over the years, and this was one way to try and address that. The other enhancements include the addition of HPTRM, which is high performance turf reinforced mat. This is a geotextile fabric that will be placed across the crown of the levee to provide protection for against erosion and wave overtopping. The other aspect of this is that the levee is still going to provide 1 foot of freeboard between both sides. But as Stephanie pointed out, when you have a big event where a lot of water is coming off the Sacramento River and flowing down the Yolo Bypass, this levee is going to have water on both sides of it. There aren't a lot of features like this in the system, and so that's why questions come up like, well, what is a training levee? Well, this isn't the only one in the system. For example, there's one off the Sacramento Bypass, north of West Sacramento on the east side of the Yolo Bypass. These types of features are sometimes used in conditions like this where you need to protect one side or the other, but they still remain hydraulically connected. The Yolo Bypass is backwatering up Cache Slough, but this just kind of keeps it from raising water surfaces on the upper ends of Cache Slough and Haas Slough in a way that's undesirable. So let's go to the next slide, Stephanie. So, in terms of, my role in the project, my background, I said I'm a civil engineer. Most of where I spend my time is focused on hydrology and hydraulics. And I do a lot of numerical modeling to analyze setting design water surface elevations, looking at potential transfer of risk between different parts of the system. And so the approach we took on this project, we use a series of models to support our analysis. We start with the regional hydrology data sets that have been developed by DWR and the Corps, what they call the Central Valley Hydrology Study, or CVHS. That gives us our boundary conditions, estimates the distribution of rain and snowmelt that could create a hypothetical 100-year storm, for example. We run that through a hydraulic model that represents the entire system at a fairly coarse level, using a piece of software called HEC RAS, which was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers for analyzing riverine systems like this one, and then take the results from that regional model and use that to, at a finer scale, develop what's called a two-dimensional hydraulic model, which I'll get into some of the results and show you what this looks like here in a few minutes. But the way to think about this is as we start zooming in on the project and trying to understand the details and effects of what's going on, we start to use higher and higher resolution tools. And the two-film model that we use basically allows us to look at water moving not just in one direction like we would in the HEC RAS model, but allows us to look at water moving in multiple directions at once across a grid. And then the final tool we use is once we've set the design water surface elevations using two-flow, we do an additional analysis for the wind wave analysis to look at the effects of opening up the levee system the way we're proposing using a tool called Swan Veg. Swan is a wind wave tool that's used in a lot of coastal settings for looking at wave run-up conditions. The Veg piece of this is a unique module that has been developed for looking at the effects of adding vegetation. In this case, as we look at the Tule Marsh evolving over time, it is going to provide serve as a buffer and absorb some of the wave energy under certain conditions, and so it's reflected in that model. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we approach this, we use real data from historic events to calibrate these hydraulic models, specifically the floods of 1997 and 2006. We took some very conservative assumptions. This is what we have to do when we're doing a project that is going to be go through the permitting process with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and the Army Corps of Engineers. We have to assume that all of the levees upstream of our project are functioning. They're not going to breach, even if they overtop, basically maximizing the water delivery down to this project so that it's loaded to the maximum extent possible. Basically, it assumes that everybody else has fixed their levees upstream, and you've got the most conservative estimate of water delivery at that location. We looked at two conditions: one, what we call the baseline or present day conditions, and then we also looked at what we call a future cumulative condition, which Stephanie had an exhibit earlier up that depicted the conceptual planning efforts that DWR has done through the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, specifically features that were identified in the basin-wide feasibility study in 2017. This is just a series of project concepts that include levee setbacks and other restoration type projects in the region. But the general idea is this expansion of the capacity of the Yolo Bypass. And so this future cumulative condition assumes more water is coming over Fremont Weir because in the future it would have been expanded. The expansion at the Sacramento Weir has been implemented. Basically, this is more water coming at the project, but also some of the other projects have been implemented, and it's really just kind of looking at from a planning perspective, how does our project fit in to that framework? So let's go on, Stephanie. So basically, just kind of give you a sense of what this looks like. For example, I'm just showing one example. We ran a number of scenarios and looked at a number of different hydraulic loadings, a full range from very low flows all the way up to a 200-year event. And so what we found is, generally speaking, the project, although it's adding, some storage and some additional conveyance, its effects are fairly localized, mostly at the northeast corner of the project, where the project will divert water off of the Yolo Bypass and, serve as transitory storage off to the west inside the project footprint. But the effects, go, Stephanie pointed out, from north to south, Lookout Slough is about 3 miles tall. You can kind of see the light blue areas on this graphic kind of tell you just about how far upstream those effects go. Although, what we're talking about is maybe a tenth of a foot by the time you get to that transition between the blue and the yellow at the very upper corner there on the project impacts. So next slide, please. So, what we're talking about is very localized effects of this project. It's not going to draw more water off of the Sacramento River, either through Fremont Weir or the Sacramento Weir. It's lowering water levels locally. It's not pushing more water from one part of the system and making things worse for any of the neighboring islands or Rio Vista or any of the other communities. And the other, big benefit we talk about is, although the changes in water levels are not dramatic, this project's going to replace several miles of levees that have known performance issues, everything from not having enough freeboard to having stability problems. I mentioned some of the slope flattening on the training levee, for example. That's a section of levee that has had slips on the land side quite frequently. This project resolves some of that. It also resolves some of the under seepage problems that the current levee system suffers from. And so, what we're talking about is really taking, what is currently 8 miles of levees that have problems and getting it down to, 3.7 miles of levees, only about, a mile of which are still going to have problems with stability and erosion. So let's go on to the next. Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So, I talked about this being, this is obviously a multi-benefit project. We're talking about, I just talked about, looking through the lens of flood protection. I'm going to talk now about what this project, the big show is, and the purpose, the primary purpose, as Stephanie said, is, this is also a fisheries project that's targeting ecosystem restoration. And so we use some of the same tools, but at a different scale and different time scale to do this analysis. We use, in this case, rather than large design events like a 100 or a 200-year storm, now we're looking at historic tidal hydrology. This is really going to be the driver for what makes the tidal marsh work or not. We're using boundary conditions from a regional hydrodynamic model developed by RMA that is used commonly for looking at regional water quality analyses, salinity, and other different water quality constituents, changes in tidal range at the regional level. We used the RMA, worked with us also, and analyzed the project effects at a regional scale, but we've taken information from that model and use that to feed a more site-specific hydrodynamic model that's focused on ecosystem restoration components. And I'll talk about this in a moment, but we use the results from that to do a particle tracking analysis that will represent and simulate food web export and productivity. So next slide, please. So, when we're thinking about the hydrology of this site and really what's going to kind of really make things work from a habitat restoration perspective, there's kind of two things we want to keep in mind in terms of how we're going to grade the site. And really it boils down to the hydrology being the biggest driver. Here on the West Coast, we are in an environment where the tides are essentially diurnal, or semi-diurnal, which means you've got 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. And when we look at the average of those higher high tides over a given period of time, we get what we call the mean higher high water. And then we do look at the average of the lower of the low tides, and that's what we call mean lower low water. When we take that intertidal range and we map that out across the landscape, what we start to see is that certain types of vegetative communities and habitat types start to emerge that we're interested in reproducing at Lookout Slough. For example, tules, this is the general range of elevations that they tend to thrive in. If you start to get, if we start going down slope, and if the grading were lower, we would start to see less tules, and we begin transitioning to this shallow subtidal habitat where plants like tules become stressed and waterlogged, and you don't see quite as much colonization of that type of vegetative community. Really, mean higher high water is kind of the edge of that zone that we're interested in. So when we're thinking about grading or even site selection, these are the ranges of elevations that we're kind of interested in. And so if we go to the next slide, if you look at Lookout Slough and the project site that EIP identified, when they were out looking at properties, most of the property is already in the emergent tidal marsh zone. It's just been disconnected from Shag Slough and Cache Slough, and hasn't had access to water or the hydrology in that intertidal cycle. But the nice thing about this, though, is if you do reconnect it through breaching and making modifications to the site, you've got this opportunity to do this in a way that doesn't require you to import a lot of material to raise areas that are too low or grade down areas that are too high, which, you know, Stephanie will tell you that is really the whole ballgame in restoring these types of sites. It's extremely expensive to move dirt around, and the less of that you have to do, the better. And so I've borrowed this phrasing from many EIP slides I've seen over the course of this project. Elevation is destiny. So next slide, please. So the other thing that we kind of think about, you know, from a hydrology perspective is, you know, in addition to kind of thinking about, you know, this range of elevations and how important it is, there's a phenomena that occurs, which I'm going to call tidal damping, which is really this reduction in tidal range that occurs as energy is dissipated, as water moves in and off of these sites. You start to lose water surface elevation as you move from east to west in this case. And part of that is just you've got a natural distribution of water moving through channels, but then also you've got friction losses that occur as water goes over the marsh and through the tules and that sort of in other vegetation. It loses a lot of energy, and so you don't. It dampens and reduces the mean high water elevation as you go further and further away from the opening with these breaches. So how we size the breaches, where we locate them, that drives a lot of how this site is going to perform. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So I'll use this slide as an example, and there's quite a few things to point out here, but I'll draw your attention to, there's a small white circle on the map with the number 9. This is basically a location where we've sampled some model results, and I'm going to explain. Those results are plotted on this chart here. What you can see is, you know, this is a representation of water levels over time, and so each of these grid marks, you know, we've got the numbers 600 through 1008. Each of these tick marks is basically a 24-hour period. So you can kind of see, if you look at the grid here, you got, you know, in a 24-hour period, you've got your highs and your lows coming in and out. The gray line that you see that's going up and down, that hydrograph represents the water levels in Cache Slough at the stream. Basically, that's kind of our baseline. Is if you went back to Cache Slough or Shag Slough, that's the water level you'd be at. That's basically the purest version of the tidal signal that we can establish at this site. Now, as you move from east to west, away from the breach openings or away from the channels, and you get out onto the marsh plain, you start to see this damping effect, where you can see this in the blue hydrograph line, where we've actually sampled where the model is computing water surface elevations at location number 9. We don't have elevations that are as high as the original signal in up at the edge of the site. You can also see in this particular case, there's a dark orange dashed line. That's represents the grading of the marsh plain at this location. So you can kind of start to see, you've got, as water moves onto the marsh plain, you've got, you know, this flooding cycle and this draining cycle, but it never drains back down below elevation 4.5, because that's basically the ground elevation. If we had sampled inside one of the channels, you would see also that that receding stage as water is draining out of the site and dropping down more into the elevations of, you know, between 4 and 2. So let's move on to the next slide. So when we map the spatial distribution of that damping, we can take a look at our results. We can map mean high or high water for our baseline conditions outside, and then we can look at the mean high or high water elevations inside the site. And what we can see here is, there's some significant benefits from, some of the design features that we've included here. Specifically, what we've got on the screen here is, well, one of the questions we got asked very early was, well, could you do this project without building any tidal channels? Doing all that excavation is going to be very expensive. The problem with this is if you don't include the tidal channels, as it turns out, they're a very efficient way of delivering water across the site and moving water through that network that's relatively frictionless rather than a planar surface with a bunch of vegetation on it. What you can see here is that not only do we get a lot of tidal damping, right? This dark blue color, without the channels, we can't even wet the entire perimeter of property. So this really tells you that, told us, a lot about, the work that the channels were doing and what would happen if we didn't include them. So let's go to the next slide. So the next thing we talk about in terms of, the hydrology and how this is driving some of the ecological outcomes that we're interested in is simulating food web export. And we've done this in a very simplified manner. This isn't a complex food web model that we're talking about. We've simply used what's called a neutrally buoyant particle tracking model, taking the hydrodynamic results of the numerical model that we developed, and dropping some imaginary particles into that flow field and allowing the model to compute the pathway and track where these particles move over time. And so one of the simplifying assumptions we made is, well, if we put one of these particles and assume that was a piece of biomass, that's generated, through the normal processes of, food web activation by, simply having water out on the landscape. That water is acting like a big solar panel and photosynthesis is occurring. And we've got zooplankton and other microorganisms growing and multiplying inside that environment. How long that parcel of water sits inside the site matters. And so and I'll talk a little bit about the criteria we use for thinking about this, but the measure that we use is what we call exposure time, which is how much time did that particle spend inside of Lookout Slough? And so the question is, when we think about exposure time, it's like, well, it's not just, it was in the site for a period of time that washed out. Because we are in this tidal environment, sometimes these particles get flushed in and out, and you've got this kind of back and forth. We want to make sure that we're counting how long it spends inside this idealized environment, and that's how we're going to count the time that it's in growth mode. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So although generally speaking, longer exposure times on floodplains are considered to be beneficial for food web productivity, literature is generally, speaks to times, depending on the source material that you're reviewing. Generally 1 to 2 weeks is considered ideal for food web productivity. However, the trade-off is long exposure times also are associated with the emergence of harmful algal blooms. And there's other processes that we can't really capture in a simplified model of this kind. But, so what the real challenge is trying to balance these kind of competing aspects of water sitting on the site for any given amount of time. And so the approach we've taken is, we're not going to try and recognizing that we've got kind of these competing effects that occur when you start getting into different exposure time ranges. We've opted to take the approach of trying to acknowledge that that's the case, but also just looking for ways to make the site as variable as possible and have as much heterogeneity across the site, so that we've got some areas that have very short exposure times, some that are kind of in the ideal range, and then maybe some that are less ideal. And what we did find during design is that our ability to influence this on this site is somewhat limited because of some of the other constraints. For example, we did not have an option to, for example, connect the site directly to Cache Slough and create a flow-through type of condition, largely because we had to preserve that training levee and the integrity of that hydraulic barrier between Cache Slough and the Yolo Bypass during floods. And so as a result, really the only places we were able to create the connections between the tidal network and Cache Slough is really on the east side of the property. And so that really constrains, how much you can actually even really do to manipulate these kinds of things. So next slide. So kind of wrapping this up, I'm going to leave you with some eye candy. This is an animation of the particle tracking model results. What you can see here is the yellow and blue areas represent the depth of water inside both the site, but also the adjacent sloughs. We've mapped this so that the dark blue area is basically anything that's dark blue is 6 feet or more in depth. And then you've got these, lighter areas which are shallower. You can see the colors changing as the tide comes in and out. As the tide's coming in, the colors get darker, you get more dark blue. And as the water is receding and draining back towards San Francisco Bay through Cache Slough and through Sassoon Bay, that's when you start to see the colors lighten again. And that's coincident with those red dots, the particles moving upstream or downstream on and off the site. And so with that, I'm going to pass the microphone to Patricia, who's been working with Stephanie and I on this for the last 5 years, and let her say a few things about herself.
Thanks, John. Again, my name is Patricia Valcarcel. I'm the Regulatory Program Director at WRA and a certified wildlife biologist by the Wildlife Society. My background over the last 14 years has been primarily focused in the Sacramento and Northern San Joaquin valleys. And I did receive my master's working with the giant gartersnake through the USGS Cooperative Research Unit that was based out of Dixon. On this project, I led the wildlife studies and species permitting efforts and was the giant gartersnake expert as part of the design and permitting process. And I'll be just giving a brief overview for you all tonight in some of the species on the site, a couple of the species design considerations coming from the data that John just showed us, and some planning we did for construction minimization measures for the species. So I'm going to keep this focused on a few brief highlights. There is a lot at the site. And again, John provided us some amazing background on the modeling work that was done to help us understand the species and the potential future habitats. And then a little bit into construction planning since we are in active construction. So there's always more we can talk about on such a large project. So if there's anything you'd like to learn more about, please ask questions or reach out to us in the future. Next slide. So first, I'd like to take a step back to share a great study by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. This is from 2012 on the historical ecology of the Delta, just to reframe again where we are and what we are trying to do. If you don't know this research or this paper, it's great. There's amazing maps and images such as the ones we're sharing here today. And it maps out the Central Valley system, which was historically comprised of a network of rivers and floodplains supporting expansive, permanent, and seasonally flooded freshwater marshes and shallow lakes. So again, this is adding to that verification that this site is an ideal location, as we earlier discussed, to restore habitat that would reflect the tidal and floodplain conditions of the past. So next slide. From the same SFEI study, here's a concept image of what the upper delta is believed to have looked like in our project region. So we have the river, the main river stem with freshwater wetlands and tributary streams adjacent. And the riparian habitat is believed to have mostly been along that main river, the river channel with the tidal sloughs, wetlands, and the surrounding larger flood basin. And a lot of the species that used to inhabitat these areas, we do still have some of these present in our area. Next, so we know the fish are still present in the sloughs and channels just outside of the Lookout Slough project, such as the Delta smelt and salmonids, some of the target species for the restoration. We also have many of the bird species nesting on the Lookout project site, such as Swainson's hawk and osprey for a couple examples. And we have our native pond turtle also present on our site. Next. And we have several native plant species that are present, so we don't want to forget our flora. And some of these plant species are now actually considered rare because the tidal marsh habitat has been lost. Looking at that SFEI study, they stated that about 3% of the Delta's historic tidal wetlands remain. So that's a drastic reduction in habitat for these species. Again, this then just means we have an ideal location to restore habitats where these species are known currently or immediately adjacent, so they have potential to expand and occupy our newly created habitat. Next. So John gave a lot of background on some of the fish food production. That was a main target and goal for the project. But we also discussed another major goal for fish, and that is to promote spawning habitat with the appropriate water velocities and depths for the smelt. So this is one model that John did not talk about. And I do want to make sure people know that there was a lot of background data and research that had to be done for the biologists to then understand what the habitat would be and whether it was suitable for the species. So one aspect is water velocities in these created channels. And that's extremely important to get right for our target species when we're looking at our smelts, the Delta smelt and another listed smelt species, the longfin smelt. They are both incredibly small and they are not the strongest swimmers. And so if we're trying to create spawning habitat, we do need to make sure that they're able to access these areas and spawn safely. And so this is another key point as to why channels were created and in the shapes that they were. Versus just breaching the levees. So as John showed, we did need to create channels to restore tidal hydrology throughout the whole site. But at the scale, when we're creating channels over 2 miles long, you can result in some really bad conditions for fish. So we needed to understand the water velocity and what they would be at various times of the year. So thank you, John, for again providing us some more information. And this helped us ensure that the water velocities don't exceed the smelt's capabilities when during spawning periods, which are late winter, early spring months. That's the graph shown on the left. And also just after hatching, so when the larval stage is present, and that's kind of early summer stage. And velocities are also important for other fish species, such as juvenile salmonids, which are likely to be using this area for rearing. So all of this information helped us choose the channel shape, size, depth, and again, the orientation with some of the curves that occurred that you see on the site. Next. But again, we don't want to just focus on fish species. We do have another goal for the project to make sure that it does support other special status species. And after all of our early site assessments describing the other species we just showed, there was one other species that stood out, and it was a large unknown for us. Next. This is the giant gartersnake. And for those of you who don't know this snake, it is a semi-aquatic reptile. It is listed as threatened under the Federal and State Endangered Species Act. The historical distribution appears to follow the large flood basins, freshwater wetlands, and tributary streams of the valley, so it is endemic to this area of California. And at the Lookout Slough site, the drainages and wetlands in portions of the site looked highly suitable, but based on studies that have been conducted last about 10 years prior to us doing our work, it was believed to be extirpated in the region. At this time, we were questioning whether this was true, given some restoration work that had been happening in the area, and they are incredibly difficult to detect. It costs a lot to survey for them. It's time consuming and you don't get the greatest return on effort. So that means you can spend a lot of time and money, but if you don't catch or see one, that doesn't actually mean that it might not be there. So you can miss the species. And so for us, we turned to some technology that was new at the time to assist us in understanding the potential presence of this very cryptic species in the area. Next, this is environmental DNA. or eDNA for short. This has been around for a while. Predominantly, it's been used for fish monitoring and detection, but only a few years ago, it did start to expand its use to other aquatic species, such as amphibians and aquatic reptiles. Essentially, what we're doing as part of this is to collect water samples, and you pull them through a filter, so you can see us collecting the samples on the right. And then an analysis is run with a DNA assay that's specific for the target species. And through that, if there's any matching, you know that the DNA of the species is present in your sample. And for cryptic species that can take an extensive survey effort, the ability to take systematic water samples for analysis can allow us to get an educated assessment on species presence with a drastically reduced effort. And because we're trying to assess over 3,000 acres and the time and money to do more thorough surveys are not actually feasible, this new assay allowed us to really provide a much quicker assessment method. And so we took this assay, which had just been developed for its first real world test. And as you can see, we actually found it. It was present, the DNA was present in several locations at the site. And there are caveats to how much information you can gather from this type of sampling effort. And it was a new test. So in order to confirm true presence, we did need to identify it with individuals before we could call the species present. But regardless, at this phase, we knew to start assuming the species was in the area and to start including it in our design and permitting analyses. But we were able to get confirmation of species presence with documentation of individuals during a levee repair project. And we also engaged the USGS to conduct trapping at the lookout site. Next. So now we're back to thinking about designing and creating habitat for the species that we know are present. Our last unknown has been confirmed. And that with all these species that are historically sharing the same and similar space, we just had to make sure that we were thinking of tweaks to ensure components for all the species were being considered. So marsh vegetation is a very important component to many of these species, and the types shown in the models are an important factor for species, primary food production, and understanding the marsh types that might be present. But there are other factors we had to consider when working on this large scale and for non-fish species. Next slide. So turning back to gartersnake and just focusing in on a small area of the overall site, I just want to remind first that gartersnake is semi-aquatic, so it does need both uplands in addition to that emergent marsh and aquatic habitat, and it brumates or overwinters in upland refugia. So these snakes are more associated with slower moving backwaters and not those main or larger slough channels. So again, that velocity information is very helpful. And so we created ponds specific for the snake near uplands next to the setback levee. So they would have more protected areas for foraging or aquatic habitat that were adjacent to basking and refuge sites. And we also took the PG&E access peninsulas, which were an opportunity for us to create additional upland habitat. PG&E actually doesn't need winter access, so the peninsulas could have been at lower elevations, but we raised those as high as we could using the excavated materials on site to provide higher elevation upland habitats that would be above flood levels in most years, and thus give us some winter habitat for the garter snake. And then looking at Shag Slough levee, which will, after breaching, will leave islands that are also going to be left at current heights. Those will also be able to provide upland and winter habitat in flood years. And finally, the next and last point on upland is that in discussions with agencies, we really wanted to provide flood protected habitat where we could as well, so non-exposed uplands. And we were able to still meet our project goals by shifting the setback levee further east. So we were able to open up about 25 acres of flood protected upland habitat for the snake. That's adjacent to a non-tidal slough or its aquatic habitat. So trying to meet all the species needs, both protected and also created in the newly exposed historical style habitat. Next. And a lot of what we designed for gartersnake is also important for our other aquatic reptile, the pond turtle. So for gartersnake, we also took into thought and care about how we would revegetate and maintain those PG&E access peninsulas. And here's a cross-section of that revegetation plan. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but there is a revegetation and management plan that has been designed specific to benefit gartersnake, and that is going to translate to benefits for pond turtle. So for pond turtle, what we are thinking here are nesting habitat. The species nests in uplands, and successful nesting is an extremely important piece to the species viability, and some of the declines are partially thought for the species to be related to loss in nesting habitat. And we've been learning new information on how pond turtles nest. So it's not uncommon that pond turtles will hatch, but stay in their nest over the winter and not actually emerge until spring. So not only do we need to provide the actual habitat itself, that grassland areas up on the peninsulas, we need to have areas that are going to remain above winter flood areas to not inundate the nests. So raising those peninsulas for gartersnake, winter habitat, and those shag slough levee islands are going to mean we have pond turtle nesting habitat as well that are going to remain above winter flood levels in most years. Next. And I want to point out why we keep saying above flood levels in most years. This region has always flooded and it still floods. I'm sure we are experiencing this today. So this photo is from SFE, the SFAI report we mentioned earlier, and an image from the Yolo Bypass in 2017. And as I mentioned, we can probably see this today if we just walked out to the bypass. But these species are present in these flood exposed areas and are known to persist. And we still need to research to continue to help shed light on factors that might influence their presence in flood exposed habitats, but we know they can exist and survive as long as we have areas that are not inundated every year or for extended periods. Next. And just a quick flashback to the concept design for planting on the PG&E peninsulas. On the north side of the peninsulas, as described, we will be having riparian planting. So we're going to have taller overstory trees and understory trees planted, and this is going to provide the complex, the complex and dense vegetation structure many of our sensitive riparian bird species need. So there is hope actually that this expanded habitat is going to become occupied in the future by Lisbell's vireo as it is recovering and expanding back into its historical range in the north. Next, and now to turn to a little bit of some aspects of construction planning. We needed to think about what to do with all these species that we know are present on the site during construction. And often the approach is to clear an entire site of the species and vegetation at the start of work. But when we're working over 3,000 acres, you can't do that effectively. And then we actually have some opportunities with the amount of space we have to work with. So a contractor can't be everywhere all at once. And many of our wildlife species that are less able to move out of the area completely are tied to water and aquatic habitats. So they can't just fly off. They're going to follow that water that's on site. So we mapped the water system that was present on the site, its flow, how species habitats were associated to it, and we came up with plans. We created dewatering plans, species translocation plans, and temporary habitat plans. So water at the site flows from north to south, and it's pumped off-site in the southeast. And this works well for the flow of construction, which will start on the setback levee in the north and require dewatering as the work areas need to be dry. So we would dewater through the existing system and dry out the northern areas first, leaving water present in the south. Next, and as water is flowing from north to south, and the first work areas dry out, the species are going to self-relocate. So I'm talking about the aquatic species here. So our pond turtles, our gartersnake, and other species associated directly to water. And biologists are also present just to make sure that everything is dry before work is occurring. Species have relocated out of the area, or biologists will relocate if a species cannot move on its own. So you can see here an example of our year one expected work areas. So that's going to be focused on the north and the setback areas and areas to focus dewatering. And this is overlain with a map of existing gartersnake habitats. So we can kind of see how the two are going to interact. And since we are working over such a large area, as we moved through time, how habitat was drying and changing and where things were working, we actually found that there were areas that would be avoided throughout the project until the very last phase when breaching would occur. And so that is in the south where water is flowing through as part of the dewatering process anyway. And we created this area to be a temporary refuge for giant garter snake, and that we would then fence it and protect it for several years over the project construction to maintain habitat. Next. And so here you can see a managed area, the managed area zoomed in, and we've called this a temporary relocation area. So garter snake, the plan would be to follow the water as it's draining into this area. And once enough of the area has elsewhere out of the project site has been dewatered, and we believe a lot of the snakes would be concentrated in this area, then we'd construct a fence to ensure that snakes don't move back into construction zones when they're seeking upland refuge in the winter, and can be protected. So any snakes that would be found elsewhere on the site after the fence is constructed would be relocated here to protect them. So we actually established this area at the end of the 2022 season, and it's in active use. It's going to be managed, or it is managed, for both aquatic and upland habitat, so the species needs can be met over the next couple of years. And then the fence is going to be removed as part of the final prep work ahead of breaching activities, so the snakes can start expanding into some of the created habitats ahead of the actual breaching event. Next. And we also did a similar concept for this involving a plant species, so a non-mobile species. And not all plants can use seed collection as a way to mitigate or spread the species. So it's not a viable option for a species such as Mason's liliopsis, and transplantation is much more appropriate. Mason's liliopsis is a tidal marsh plant, so it's actually only located currently on the outboard side of the levees, and it is present in some of our breach areas. So we went and mapped all of the occupied areas, all potentially suitable habitats, and identified locations that we could move the species to if it was found in a breach or impact zone. And we actually the translocations were actually completed in the 2022 work season, and we are monitoring those plants now as work is ongoing. So as year 2 is about to begin, work continues on the setback levee and the larger tidal channel networks. We have several species protections already in place. And again, this is just kind of a brief overview of a few aspects for our plant and wildlife species. And if you would like to know any more, please ask questions or reach out. And I will pass this back to Stephanie for the conclusions.
Thank you, Tricia. Well, yeah, we have a lot to cover with this project, and we tried to dive in deep in a couple different facets, but there are a lot of complexities. So I just want to say that if you do have any questions, like Patricia said, of course, feel free to reach out either on this call or if you think of something after. But just to kind of conclude with some of what we think the takeaways are, we definitely do see this project has moved very fast, but we did do a lot of due diligence and outreach and a lot of really technical work to develop the project to this point. So we have arrived at construction last year after less than 4 years of navigating a complex entitlement and design process. And I think I mentioned already, but we expect 2 more years of construction. So this year and 2024 to complete construction for this project. We see definite benefits for public agencies to partner with private companies to expedite timelines and reduce costs for needed restoration outcomes. I know before DWR entered into contract with EIP, they evaluated the timing and cost to do a project of this scale and found that this partnership would likely provide significant time and cost value to the state. And this has proven to be true as partnerships with private and public entities. You really get to use the strengths of both the public sector and the private sector to move a project forward. So in a nutshell, the project is going to create over 3,100 acres of natural freshwater tidal marsh in the Cache Slough Complex region that's going to benefit multiple species, including delta smelt, salmonids, giant gartersnake, riparian birds, many other species beyond this. These are just some listed. And it's also going to have regional flood conveyance benefits through increasing the flood conveyance capacity of the Yolo Bypass, which is really important to be doing projects like this as weather patterns become less and less predictable. It will be adding over 40,000 acre feet of transitory storage to the Yolo Bypass and replacing 7 miles of deficient levees with about 3 miles of a brand new levee built to today's engineering standards. So with that, I will open it up to questions and just put up all of our contact here in case anyone after this meeting wants to get a hold of either myself, John, or Patricia. And thank you for hanging on this long to everyone who's on here.
Lots of wonderful information. We truly appreciate the work that you all are doing and the sharing. We have a few questions that have come in. First one I think you already addressed was about the training levy, but another, Joellen brought up, who's footing the bill for all of this great work?
So California Department of Water Resources is the project funder. So they are funding this project through 2 different funding mechanisms associated with their mitigation requirements for the State Water Project. And then there are some funding coming out of the flood benefits associated with the project. So DWR.
We also have a question about the schedule. What is the project schedule?
Yeah. So essentially, we have gone through the design and entitlement phase. We really started that even before we were under contract. We started doing baseline assessments out at the site. EIP was doing that. And we really started entitlement in 2017 or 2018. And we're able to get all of our approvals needed to start construction this past May, so May 2022. So our construction is going to span 3 years. So we've already completed one of those years in 2022. We're gearing up to start construction again this year once the site dries out after all those rains. And we're still on schedule to complete construction next year. So it would be late next year that we are expecting to be able to, the final step would be breaching the Cache Slough levee in those 9 locations.
Also, what are the expectations for breeding ducks?
We've done a lot of analysis over dabbling and diving ducks. So half of the property was Liberty Farms Duck Club, a private duck club, and we wanted to definitely show that we're maintaining duck habitat, but we acknowledge that we're changing some of the dabbling and diving habitat. So essentially, all of the intertidal habitat will be food web production for ducks that we think is going to be beneficial. The freshwater tidal habitat will be covered in tides daily and then it will drain, but the actual tidal channels and anything that was on the design as open water habitat would be, the margins of that would be suitable for dabbling ducks where it's a little shallower, and then kind of the center of the channels would be suitable for diving ducks.
What is the plan to against invasive plants such as water hyacinth?
great question. All of these are great questions, but yeah, that is something that is always being discussed in the Delta and this region. We know it's out there. We've designed this project to the extent that we can to have good tidal flushing, which we think will help with invasives. But essentially, once this project is fully constructed, there are mechanisms for ongoing management of the site, and there's funding associated with that. So it is expected that DWR will continue to manage the site, and they have a fish restoration program that's set up to manage their properties. So it would be an ongoing effort.
Is the upland habitat going to be accessible for hiking and bird watching?
So that is another good question. We definitely tried to, we considered where we could allow access for the public, and really gave that a lot of consideration and analysis, and had conversations with a lot of our regulatory partners as well as public partners to try to figure out where we could fit things in. The existing levees out there, a lot of them will be cut off through breaching along Cache Slough levee, and then the new duck slough setback levee that will be constructed is not going to necessarily be accessible or open to the public. There will be gates preventing people from driving up on the levee, since it's a flood control feature. North of the northernmost breach along Cache Slough, there will be an area, a stretch that would be accessible for like pedestrian access. And that's essentially to that boat ramp that exists at the northernmost breach, where people could launch kayaks and access the waterways.
Also, Robin, our previous executive director, and she coordinates our fellowship program, wanted to be sure that you knew that we do have a graduate student in his second year doing eDNA sampling for the giant gartersnake and the western pond turtle on the Yolo Bypass wildlife area through the funding of our fellowship program. So that we heard about that earlier this season, if anybody wants to roll back to see about Stephen's work. Another question about the boat. What is the largest boat that would be able to use the boat ramp?
I, at one point in time, knew this detail, but it's not committed to memory. So that is a question I can't answer, and something I could definitely follow up on. But the boat ramp is going to be, it's a pretty broad slope. So it's a matter of, there's going to be a gate before the boat ramp, so you can't drive a vehicle and put a motorized boat in at the boat ramp, but you could carry like a kayak to hand launch. So that might answer the question.
And then our last question is, who can access that boat ramp?
Yeah, so that boat ramp is going to be accessible for essentially agencies to access the bypass during emergencies, for the Coast Guard to access Solano County, DWR, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So it's because of concerns with this being a mitigation site, in addition, that it's on a levee and there's liability concerns with that. There's several kind of factors playing into that it does need to be gated for agency access.
So is there then parking? How much parking will be there near that boat ramp?
So there is an existing roadway, Liberty Island Road, and we're essentially maintaining the existing uses of Liberty Island Road. So people do currently park along the right of way, and they can continue to do so. At the end of the road, there's going to be a turnaround that will have a gravel opening kind of within the turnaround that could serve for potential parking.
Great. All right. Well, that is going to be our final question for the evening. Again, I do want to thank all of our speakers tonight that shared knowledge and information. I'm trying to find you all so that I can bring you back up. Let's see. Adding John and Patricia. There you guys are. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us this evening, sharing your work with Lookout Slough. Appreciate your time. And you're getting many comments. I hope you can see them coming in of appreciation in the chat. Thanks for joining us, everyone, tonight. Have a good evening. I hope we see you back in April, where we learn about the restoration that's going on with the Resource Conservation District in the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you all.